Great news! Brandon Sanderson's secret project books are now all officially released. Huzzah! And not only that, but I have read all of them. More huzzah! So now the question is, should you read them? The short answer is yes. Yes, you should. All right, that was a great video. Everybody wrap it up. We can all go home. As if I'm not the only one here. No, but seriously, there are different reasons why you should or shouldn't read these books at this point where you are. It depends on how many of Sanderson's works you have read so far, which ones you've read, and I want to go through that today. It might help you decide which books you want to dive into, especially if you're a newbie. So, this video is specifically targeted for people who might be new to Brandon Sanderson, whether you have never read a book of his before, or if you have read some of them and you want to see if you have read enough to enjoy these books. So I'm going to caveat this by letting you know now that these are just my opinions. I'm caught up on the Cosmere and I have read some of the Skyward series. So right now, most of my perspective is based on my enjoyment of the Cosmere works. The secret projects in order of release are Tress of the Emerald Sea, The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and The Sunlit Man. Now, if you are completely new to Brandon Sanderson's work, these first three are good books to start with. That's my general recommendation. However, if you're new to Brandon Sanderson's books, then I would hold off on reading The Sunlit Man until later. And I'll give you explanations as to why I think that when I dive into it. First, let's dive into Tress of the Emerald Sea. This is by far one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson works to date. It is also a standalone, which means that you can read it without having had experience with any of his books before. Now, one thing to note is that most of Brandon Sanderson's books take place in a connected universe called the Cosmere. This is one of those books, so it does have references to other storylines that also take place in the Cosmere. However, I would say that those references are fairly limited, and they're general enough that it's not going to really spoil anything if you're new. Here are a couple of caveats to starting with this book first. A lot of Brandon Sanderson's fans have noted that this is different than his usual style. So if you've never read any of Brandon Sanderson's books before, and you start with this and jump into another one of his previous works, it might be a little jarring. Because the tone is very sweet, it's very playful, it's very whimsical, whereas a lot of Sanderson's other works are more grounded. So just note that if you start with this is not his usual style. Now, a couple of things about Tress of the Emerald Sea. This book is very fairy tale-esque. I happen to really enjoy it because it reminds me of some of my favorite stories like The Princess Bride, Ella Enchanted, and Treasure Planet. It has some elements of sci-fi, but most of it is fantasy, and it's very fun, it's very adventurous, and honestly, and I'm not going to show it here because I want you to experience it for yourself, the art in this book is fantastic. If you want to get your feet wet into other parts of the Cosmere before you read this, I recommend reading Mistborn Era 1 and 2 and possibly even Elantris. Those are the stories that have the most connection to this book. Next, let's talk about The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England. I will not be calling it the rest of that video, I'm just going to call it Frugal Wizard from now on. Despite the title, this book is actually more sci-fi than it is fantasy. It does have some fantasy elements, but you can definitely see where most of it is sci-fi related. Much like Tress of the Emerald Sea, this book is more whimsical and playful in its style and tone. It is also written in first person, which is not typical of Brandon Sanderson's style outside of the Skyward series. When I was in high school and college, I read a lot of works by the comedic writer Dave Barry. And when I was reading this, it made me think of that a lot. So I actually gravitated towards this writing style. I found it very entertaining, very humorous. I laughed quite a bit. But some things that people have said about this book, which I do agree with, is that it is not very true to Brandon Sanderson's typical writing style. While it does have a lot of elements of Brandon Sanderson's strength in writing in terms of his story structure and his plot, the emotional oomph that tends to go with his books that a lot of people love is kind of lacking in this book. Still, I do think that if you're new to Brandon Sanderson, this is a decent place to start. Just know that it's not generally seen as one of Sanderson's strongest works. Finally, here's what you need to know about Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Much like Tress of the Emerald Sea, this one is also a Cosmere standalone. While it does take place in the Cosmere universe and has connections to other stories in the Cosmere, it does not have strong connections to the stories to where if you started with this, you would be lost. In the author's note of this book, Brandon Sanderson cites that he was inspired by animes like Your Name and story elements in video games like Final Fantasy X. Now, something that you should know about me, as I am a huge fan of this book, is that I love shoujo anime and manga. I grew up on that stuff. This sweater is from Fruits Basket, so have that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about how much I love this book. If you are not generally a fan of that kind of story, this may not be for you, but if you are, then you are in for a treat. This is very whimsical, it's very magical, it's very sweet, it's got a lot of heart to it, but the pacing is a little slower. So just know that it is more geared for readers who enjoy a slower paced, heartfelt story. Now, if you want to get your feet wet into the Cosmere before you read this book so you have a little bit more context, then I recommend reading all of the Stormlight Archive, including the novella Dawn Shard. That is where this has the most connection to the Cosmere. Finally, the Sunlit Man. Like I mentioned, this is not really a good place to start in the Cosmere because if you do, then you're going to be very confused. Now, this book is a non-stop thrill ride. It is jam-packed with action. It is so hard to put down. But if you are new to Brandon Sanderson's work, please do not start here. At the very least, read all of the Stormlight Archive through the Rhythm of War and Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell. Those are the Cosmere stories most connected to the Sunlit Man and will give you the context to fully enjoy everything happening here. While there are references to the Mistborn saga, I don't think it is fully necessary to read that before you get into this. And that's a wrap. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Did you read any of the Secret Project books? If you did, let me know your thoughts on them. And tell me if you're new to the Cosmere. If you're new to Brandon Sanderson's work, what did you think and what would you like to see next in the future? Thanks everybody. See you next time.